In this podcast, I want to talk about document design, or the way that your document, your report looks on the page. It goes without saying that it should be clean, it should be printed off on good paper without a lot of extra marks on it, that somebody looking through it should sense that it's a professional document. It should also be easy to skim. People usually don't read reports, they skim reports, they read them very quickly, they look at headings and they look at basic organization, and they need to be able to get as much as possible of the report in just a few minutes. The design of your document should reflect the organizational pattern that you're using. That means that the headings and subheadings should fit. If it's a geographically organized, they should mirror the geography. If it's a problem and a solution, they should mirror the problem and the solution. That you should just organize and design the document around the way that you've structured it. Finally, you should present information in several different ways. Repetition is not usually bad in reports, but you shouldn't repeat the same information in the same fashion. So if you say it once in the text, you should also say it on a table or a graph or a chart or some kind of a diagram. Visuals usually work very well in reports, so bond with the features in Excel and Word that make charts and graphs and tables, because those allow you to present a lot of information in a way that's easy to skim, easy to assimilate, and easy to talk about. Look at the three mini documents on this table: bad, better, and best. This is the same information, but it's three different strategies of document design. And if you look at the far left-hand column labeled bad, you see a document that doesn't look good. And I want to kind of break down why it sucks so much. First of all, it uses a font that is not proportional. The font is an old-fashioned typewriter font called Courier that prints every letter the exact same size. So the font looks old-fashioned and it's hard to read. It's completely right justified, which means that the right-hand column lines up, which means that in order to get that to happen, the font has to skip a lot of spaces internally so that it doesn't look even and smooth. You usually don't want to right justify for that reason. Also, there's a lot of information in there that could be represented in a much more easy to read way, and it becomes confusing. It's almost unreadable. It's only a paragraph, but somebody reading this paragraph would have a very difficult time understanding what's being said. In the better version, the center version, we took what the paragraph was about, which are the four subjects of this mythical interview project that we've done, and we used a proportional font. This is Times Roman, and we just put the information in bullet points instead of in the text so that people can see who these people are and what describes and represents them. Finally, let's go to the document labeled best. And here, I think we have even a cleaner font. This is the Calibri font. It uses the same bullet point strategy, but it bolds the name of each person, and it uses a cleaner bullet point which indents everything under the person's name so that there's a little more white space in it, and it skips spaces between each person so that your eyes can focus on very discrete chunks of information and assimilate them. This is just the way that you design a document in order to be easy to skim, easy to read through, and easy to find stuff in when you need to go back and reference it. Computers these days come with hundreds of fonts, and you can go online and get thousands of other fonts and put them in and use them in your reports, but you probably shouldn't, because there are only 5 or 6 fonts that are any good and that ought to be used. The 3 characteristics you want to make sure your font has when you're doing a business document, and most computers default to a font that does all 3 of these things. Font should be proportional, serif, and unobtrusive. Let me break down those terms. A proportional font is one where small letters, narrow letters, take up less space than broad or large letters. M is the largest letter. It takes up the most amount of space on the line, whereas I is usually the thinnest letter. It takes up the least amount of space. A non-proportional font, such as Courier, is a font that's based on the old typewriter typography, where every letter is a block and it takes up the same amount of space. So an I takes up the same amount of space as an M. Students usually love non-proportional fonts like Courier because it makes the paper longer. Readers, however, hate them because they're hard to read. The proportional font is much easier on the eyes. Okay, serif versus sans serif. If you look at the Century School Book font, it's one of the most aggressively serif fonts out there. Look at the C, you'll see that at the top of the C there's a little foot. And if you look at the N and the T, there are little feet that create vertical and horizontal lines in the font. And those feet guide the reader's eyes towards a center point. Arial is a sans serif font. That means those feet aren't there. That mythical line that's constructed by the feet doesn't appear. Normally, we use non-serif or sans serif fonts for headings and serif fonts for the text. Finally, Times Roman, one of the most common default fonts of most computers, is an unobtrusive font. You read it, you don't notice that it's a font at all. It just looks like writing. Rosewood and most of the fonts, besides the 5 or 6 common standard fonts, are obtrusive fonts. They're specialty fonts. They're used for posters and flyers and banners and things. They don't make good text. You don't ever want your font to become an issue. You don't ever want anybody to notice that you're using a font. It should become completely part of the background of your report. This is a paperback book published in 1944. It's the first book by a young author named Saul Bellow. If you open it up, you will see, I'm going to hold it up here, that there are a lot of words crammed onto pages. The book itself is very small, the type is very small, the margins are very large, and as a result, they were able to sell this book for 75 cents, even though it's a pretty long book, by cramming as many words as possible onto as few pages and costing as little as possible. This is the last book that Saul Bellow published when he was 88 years old. It was published in 2000. It's about the same length as his first book, Dangling Man. But if you open this up, you'll find that the text just looks a lot different. The type is larger. There are a lot more room in the margins. There's a lot more spacing in between the lines. And this book sold for, you'll see, $13. Well, there's, of course, a difference in how much money was worth in 1944 and in 2000, but people are willing to pay more for books that they don't have a hard time reading. And as long as books still last, because the Kindle, you can make it any size that you want, or the electronic readers, but you're probably never going to see a book like this again. These were very common in the 30s and 40s because people just don't like to read text like that. This is the function of white space, of space without words on it, and white space is an important part of reports. Write a longer report if necessary in order to include more white space so that people don't get a headache when they read, so that they can assimilate the information that you're offering them in manageable chunks. So use at least 1-inch margins all around your page. That's top, bottom, and both sides. Skip spaces regularly between paragraphs, between headings and subheadings. Make sure that there are spaces that don't have text in them. Write short paragraphs. Don't just cram a lot of information into one paragraph. Break the paragraphs up and indent frequently to show, you'll put white space on your left and right hand margins too. You can use the indentations to show the relationships between your main and your subordinate points. But make sure that your text isn't just words. People's eyes and their brains need a break from words all over the place. Let's return to our mythical study of people who came to Newman for various reasons. You look at the right-hand side and there's a bad and a good example of how to include this data. Let me read the bad example just so you can see how confusing it is. There were several other factors that contributed to the participants' desire to come to Newman, including whether or not they were residents of Wichita, whether or not they were contacted by another school, whether or not they had a relative at Newman, and whether or not they received a scholarship. The following table represents how each participant was or was not influenced by these factors. The first of these factors, residency in Wichita, was important to Linda McGraw, Tony Johnson, and Beverly Himmelman, but not to Steve Walensky. The second factor, contact by another school, was important only to Steve Walensky. The third factor, a relative at Newman, played a part in the decision made by Linda McGraw and Beverly Himmelman. The fourth factor, the receipt of a scholarship, was important only to Tony Johnson. Nobody's ever going to have any idea what that says if they read it or if somebody reads it to them. So what you want to do is put the information into a table. And the table there under the good section simply takes all of that information and puts it into a representational form that people can look at and refer back to whenever they need to. Use tables and charts and diagrams whenever you possibly can. It makes the information so much easier to digest. Finally, you want to make sure that if you were writing a document or a report of any length at all, you put headings into it. You break up the information and you put little chapter headings or titles to the information so that people can very quickly see how the information is organized. Some rules about headings or some guidelines about headings, and if you look on the right, here is a report. It uses the APA style headings about problems with inner city schools, and you'll see that it just keeps breaking up the information into several different levels so that people could really read the headings as an outline, and if they didn't want to, not have to read the whole report. Headings can, but don't have to use sans serif fonts. You can use something like Arial for a heading, even if you're using something like Times Roman for the body of your text, or I often actually keep the headings in the same font as the text. Headings should reflect the organizational structure of the report. If you've based your organization chronologically or geographically or all of the other patterns that we talked about in the last podcast, that gives you the titles of your heading usually. Headings can either be informative, they can be short sentences that say something about what's going to follow, or they can just be single word categories or topics like the ones you see on the right. You can use multiple levels of headings in a report. Here you have family structure in the inner city, and there are some subheadings beneath that, and then there will be another heading. So you can have headings and subheadings within a document. Make sure you use white spacing and indentation to show the relationship between the heading and the subheading. And finally, your headings must be grammatically parallel. Single parent families, parents' educational level, those are both the same kinds of phrases. If I were to say single parent families and why children leave school, those are not the same. One's a question, one's kind of a category modified noun. So you need to make sure that if you're using verbs or nouns or adjectives plus verbs or adverbs plus verbs, adjectives plus nouns, that whatever kind of grammatical structure you use for one heading, you use for every other heading within that level, or else it will read badly and it will confuse people. So those are some basic tips on document design. As with everything else we've talked about in here, though, the major rule is think about what you're doing and do it in a way that's consistent and helpful to the reader.